Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones. So glad you could join us today. And we are continuing our journey through the Daodejing, and we are currently in chapter 51. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Tao gives birth, Da rears, things. Another way we could talk about things is environment, shape, circumstances complete. So we'll pause here for just a moment and just notice a couple of things. We've got a couple of different angles at which we're talking about how things come to be and why things are the way that they are. So initially, it talks about Tao, and as we've seen, there's a lot of aspects of Tao that come into play here, but at a fundamental level, it's dealing with these patterns of how things work in the universe. So there's something to these patterns, this way of being that allows things to come into what we would say like come into existence. Now, the Taoist worldview, of course, is in a sense, there is no nothing, that what we think of as nothing or it's talked about as absence is actually a something. It's just in a more of an unformed state. So we have this movement from unformed to formed, which would be this idea of how something is maybe given birth or comes into existence. And we want to note that it is applying a very feminine way of describing this process. So, one of the other points we've noted throughout the looking through the Tao Te Ching is there is that yin yang concept that is coming into play that kind of undergirds a lot of classical Chinese thinking. And part of how it's used as a way of thinking is how you critique a situation or an environment. Is it, in balance between the yin and the yang, or is it out of balance? And if it's out of balance, how do you bring it back into balance? And I would argue that a big chunk of the material in the Daodejing is suggesting that the cultural disease that's happening during this warring states period is because an over assertion of yang, which tends to be about control, tends to be more masculine oriented. And so there's a movement to reassert a stronger yin back into it, not to overcompensate, but to bring things back into balance. And that yin, of course, deals more with that novelty or what can seem like chaos because it's new, it's maybe different, but it's also what's associated with the feminine, again, because of that new life. And so here we see that being brought to the fore again in really kind of two aspects. Tao is giving birth, and Da, it says, rears. So we even have more of this ongoing maternal process that is happening. Da, excuse me, Da, as we've talked about, is thinking about how does something fully manifest these patterns that constitute Tao. And so things in nature, we would say, fully represent that because they're simply doing what they do according to those patterns. But here it's taking this almost in more of a anthropomorphizing both of them in terms of this idea of giving birth and rearing in terms of how things are brought to fruition, how they come in to being. So there's these kind of core aspects of these patterns that we don't have direct access to. And then we also have this kind of way that they naturally unfold in terms of the Tao and the Da. But then we've got two things that we might say are more external. So things, and in this case, we might think of that in terms of like the environment, shape. So we've seen and think about this all the time, how we're a product of our geography in many respects. A lot of our cultures evolve according to different geographical patterns. But we can also think about the circumstances or the events that happen in our lives. So they're really pulling together four really interesting aspects of how things come to be the way that they are. There's kind of this innate, patterns or natural process that happens, but then things continue to be shaped either through environmental factors, whether we're talking about aspects of geography or people or animals are impacted by the things around them, and also through the events that they experience, circumstances. Very keen observers of the world and trying to understand how it works. One of the things that I really like about looking through the Tao Te Ching is how much they pick up just in their observations, even though this is coming from like 2,500 years ago. It's just kind of fascinating. So what I'd like to do now is review and maybe a little bit more detail some of the things that we've talked about previously in terms of how, from a modern perspective, we look at some of these aspects and see how they correlate. It's not that the ancient writers of the Tao Te Ching had any concept of something like quantum physics or, even particle theory. They're simply trying to observe what they see and talk about it. And it's just interesting to me how well these things really kind of match up. And I'm going to bring in a few more quotes than I normally do to illustrate some of these things. So we'll start with a concept. In various ways, it's sometimes referred to as codependent origination. I think this might be one of the terms that's used within more of a Buddhist line of thinking, but it comes into play in different fields. And part of what I've mentioned before is if we think about anything in the universe, there's different ways that we identify it in terms of its properties. Is it, tall or short, fast or slow, bright or dark, or any of the different types of attributes we can think of? But what's interesting is that those properties only exist in relationship to something else. So something can only be tall if there's something else that's shorter. If there is nothing to compare it with, the property doesn't make any sense. But then you end up with an interesting conundrum in the sense that ultimately nothing exists unless everything else exists. Things only exist in relationship to each other. And so I wanted to pull in a couple of quotes here from one of my heroes in physics. His name's Carlo Rovelli, and I think he's just written some fantastic stuff in trying to understand the quantum world. So one of the things he says here is that the discovery of quantum theory, I believe, is the discovery that the properties of any entity are nothing other than the way in which that entity influences others. It exists only through its interactions. Quantum theory is the theory of how things influence each other, and this is the best description of nature that we have. I just want to continue on this thought here for a minute. This is a radical leap. It is equivalent to saying that everything consists solely of the way in which it affects something else. When the electron does not interact with anything, it has no physical properties. It has no position. It has no velocity. And I think this is a keen insight, because when we're wrestling with the questions of quantum mechanics and the mysteries of it, there is what's sometimes referred to as quantum strangeness. It seems like things don't behave in the same way at the quantum level as we expect. And part of where he's going with this, and I think this resonates well with me, is that when we go down to more of that fundamental level of trying to isolate a single particle, in this case, an electron, a piece of an atom, that if we remove it from its context, where it doesn't have any interactions, it becomes impossible to know anything about it. So quantum physics will talk about this as a superposition, that there's a probability of it being in a certain place or having a certain velocity, but until we have a way of measuring it, we don't know. Now, some would speculate that there's an actual superposition, that the electron actually is in all places or in all speeds or all directions at the same time, and it doesn't actually finally solidify into a particular one until it is measured. This led to some very interesting speculation in more of the New Age world that somehow human observation caused it to collapse, the wave function to collapse or to decohere into a particular moment or place for a specific measurement. But really, it doesn't require anything with consciousness or even any humans to be involved. Measurement is ultimately causing an interaction. So ultimately, if we're observing something, photons are involved. Photons are particles. And if we know where something is because we can observe it, it means that a photon has come in contact with it. So what's, in a sense, being suggested here is why we have this situation where it seems like a superposition or that it could be in all positions at once is because the idea of properties doesn't exist except in relationship to other things. And the more we try to remove things from having any contact of anything else to get at that more fundamental level, it has the unexpected maybe effect that suddenly we can't know anything about it. Very interesting way of addressing this question that to me makes a lot of sense, that the reason that it seems like there's this superposition, or maybe we could even say that it technically is that it's not interacting with anything. So it could actually be like those properties just don't apply until it comes into interaction with something else. And this is just fascinating to me, that in a sense, things don't exist except in relationship. It's the relationship that actually is bringing about the reality that we experience. He goes on to say the properties of an object are the way in which it acts upon other objects. Reality is this web of interactions. Instead of seeing the physical world as a collection of objects, which with definite properties, quantum theory invites us to see the physical world as a net of relations. And this comes from just a delightful little book called Helgeland. And I highly recommend it if you're at all interested in trying to understand quantum mechanics. Maybe I'll just pause here for a second because this is a fascinating idea that things only exist in relation to others. And of course, this is at more of a fundamental level. But of course, everything that we are at this macro level is a product of everything that's happening at this micro level. Any thoughts on this before we go too much further?
Um, I really align with that. Like this makes complete sense to me. I do wonder though if there is, because I don't there is a, I think, a slight difference, and maybe correct me if I'm just misinterpreting that. There's a slight difference between what you've read to us then with what as you've interpreted, in terms of that there are no things that don't have any interactions. They do not exist if they don't have interactions. And I would wonder that they might still exist. We just will never know about them because of the lack of interactions. You've mentioned it several times that in many occasions you've mentioned it as a um, how we perceive them is only through their relations, which I think is absolutely fair. But I don't think Carlo Rovelli here said that they do not exist. There are no things that ever do not exist without the properties or their interactions. I would even argue that they still might be there. We'll just never know if they are there or not because with their lack of interactions.
Well, and
I,
yeah, that's the question, right? For that quantum weirdness is what's going on? Are they there, but they're in more of a superposition, or is it that they simply only exist in relation? Or what might be there if those other relations don't exist? And maybe that's something that we don't have any way of being able to detect, because any type of detection would in fact cause an interaction.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
So it becomes very interesting.
Agree. But again, this is a pretty. It's interesting in terms of I'm familiar with the quantum theory, and I'm familiar a little bit with that realm. But I've never thought about it from this perspective, and it's just like, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. Then let's look at where we're going to take this next. And this is going to be complexity theory. So here, we've already got this interesting situation where reality is actually a composite of relationships. Complexity theory has some interesting things to say about how they originate. And this isn't a quote from anybody in particular, it's just a kind of summarizing this concept. So complex systems self-organize through local interactions among their components without guidance from an external controlling influence, leading to emergent patterns and order. This self-organization can arise from simple rules followed by individual elements, resulting in complex and often unpredictable behaviors at the macro level. So one of the things I've shown in the past is a video of starlings, how these little birds flock in such interesting patterns that they just seem to undulate and create these amazing, strange shapes. And it seems as though there's some kind of choreography that they're following, or that maybe somebody is directing their behavior. But what we found is that it's just actually each of the birds has a couple of rules that they follow based on what the bird next to them is doing. And this simple way of looking at complexity among different component parts of a larger system work is we find this happening everywhere. So even within the cells of our body, there isn't a conductor that's explaining to all the cells how we're supposed to act. It's just simply each cell has certain rules that it follows based on what's its neighbor is. And throughout all of the cosmos, everything we can see, there's a lot of these types of patterns that seem to emerge as extremely complex, that are really at a local level just being driven by a few simple rules. When we get into something like fractal patterns and we see these immense designs that come about that seem to go in infinite directions, either out or in, same thing is happening again. Few simple patterns that are designing this thing that looks extremely complex. And so the complexity is really an observation from more of a macro level, that it appears that there's something really complex going on. But as we break things down, we find that it's actually just the product of sometimes some very simple rules that are just unfolding in ways that bring about what looks very complex. So that, in conjunction with what we were just seeing from Carlo Rovelli about that quantum level of, even at the particle level, things only taking on properties through their interactions with other things around them, we start to see a way of looking at reality that is a little counterintuitive, that it's really this interconnected web where everything is actually giving shape to everything else. And the complexity that we see is how all these things are interacting with themselves. And so there's not really a sense in which we can see individuated things. As much as we talk about separate things, nothing ultimately is actually separate. That when we try to truly separate something down at that fundamental level, it breaks down. There's the idea of what makes it up is only in relation to the other things that's interacting with. And if there's nothing it can interact with, then it's hard to say that it even has any properties. I think about this a little bit with human psyches when we isolate people, either through something like a penal system where maybe somebody's put in solitary confinement, or more specifically, when they use something that's called a deprivation tank. And this is something that people will intentionally do, where there's like a very kind of a small container that has a very high saline content water that makes it so it's very easy to float in it, and they put it to essentially like body temperature, and you climb into this thing, and you basically plug up your eyes and your ears, and you float in this thing in the dark, and ultimately you kind of feel like you're not anywhere. And people go through some very interesting experiences when they are actually cut off from everything. So, not just at a material level are things really defined through their interactions, but even at a consciousness level, how we perceive the world really requires this interaction between things that gives shape to how we perceive and experience life as well. So, the final step I want to take this then, we're looking from a modern perspective at how we're starting to understand at a fundamental level this interconnectedness of everything, and how that actually gives shape to what is, and also how these complex things come about through these local interactions, through some basic rules that give rise to what appears to be extremely complex systems, to how the contrast between Western philosophy and how it developed versus what was happening in ancient China, and the interestingness that because of its isolation, it was not easy to get to China. It allowed different philosophical ideas to evolve, essentially without a whole lot of interaction. There definitely was interaction, but not to the same degree that you had in some other parts of the world that tended to be a little bit more um, consistent in their overall outlook. Even though there's a lot of different cultural variations, there was a number of things that were consistent, even though it was expressed in different ways in different cultures. We end up with some truly unique things from this Chinese culture. So one of them is this concept of Ziran, which is a phrase that can be essentially translated as of itself or self so. Sometimes it's also translated as spontaneity, which is also the way that we've talked about Wu Wei previously. So Wu Wei technically would mean non-action or no action. But by that, they're not suggesting that we're not doing anything. It is a type of doing. So within the Taoist framework, way, this idea of action can have an aspect of it in which there is this cultural overlay that is providing the values and the goals and thoughts about how we're supposed to act. So we could say there's this socially constructed way of being that people are expected to follow. And they're highly suspicious of that. And so there's this movement of how do we get to action that isn't encumbered by these cultural norms that have been imposed, which is why sometimes they'll talk about recovering the state of being a newborn child before it smiles. There was this thought within Chinese culture that as soon as the child smiles, it is smiling because it has started to adopt some of these cultural norms about what's good and bad, for example. And so that pre-smiling infant level is meant to express the concept of action that is completely natural or spontaneous, that is not encumbered by these cultural influences. And so uh, uh, at another level, this idea of Ziran is also wrestling with those same kinds of ideas, that there's a way of things acting within themselves apart from external influence, that there's kind of this internal way that things can come about. So we have this idea of itself or self. So spontaneity is part of the way we try to bring that into it as far as the English language. But what's interesting here is, as we'll see here in a second, the contrast for how these thoughts were wrestled from and more of a Western perspective. But key to understand in this Chinese perspective then is that nature models this very well, right? So when we think about Tao and we think about Da, we're talking about these ways of the world, the patterns that are involved in how things happen. And Da is this full expression of what that looks like. And so we can look to nature to see what that is. From the Taoist perspective, this becomes the ideal. This becomes the thing that we are trying to do ourselves. In a certain sense, this thinking process, we can get confused and try to imagine or do things that go outside of those patterns, outside of what's actually possible in nature. And that's where they would say a lot of our frustration comes from. It's like, trying to figure out how to fly, but ignoring gravity. If you don't pay attention to it or you reject it or whatever, you're not going to get very far. It's only once you recognize those patterns and work with them that you can actually accomplish something like flight. It's not a violation of gravity, it's working with gravity, as well as obviously other physical laws that we have to deal with. So that Chinese concept then of how should we act, and sometimes this is phrased, we saw Wu Wei as this idea of non-action in terms of not acting according to these culturally defined norms. There's another phrase that's Wei Wu Wei, which is act non-acting. So it's kind of this additional going back to how do we act in a way that's not taking into consideration these cultural norms, or at least becoming aware of their existence so that we can question them and see where they're influencing us. It's a way of trying to remove different filters from our eyes that are coloring the way that we're seeing the world. So what happened then in Western philosophy? And this is just kind of my very high level description of an aspect of it that relates to this. So Western philosophy then, following Aristotle's lead, where much of Western philosophy is coming from or gets its footing with Aristotle, his lead in questing for responsibility. So the idea for Aristotle and for a lot of people since, the question of responsibility becomes key for how do we think about human action versus just stuff that happens in nature. And for Aristotle, the key, the linchpin between that is there a way in which responsibility can be ascribed? If not, then we're just talking about natural action. So he says, it goes on to say here then, in questing for responsibility, Aristotle ends up divorcing humans from nature. Nature is deterministic, and therefore no responsibility can be assessed. For humans to have responsibility, their actions cannot be deterministic, therefore they must be other than nature. And I would say this is a very unfortunate divorce. Now, I highlighted this idea of must here because this is something that's never been able to be demonstrated. There's lots of, theories that people have come up with, including Aristotle and many others since then, of trying to explain how human action could be something other than natural in order to give us that sense of responsibility. So the way that this is normally talked about now is the question of free will versus, deterministic natural world. And what we've come to understand more thoroughly, even though concepts of this go all the way back, that the natural world unfolds according to these laws of cause and effect, that everything that's happening in the natural world is very deterministic. Somehow there was this either because of how it is experienced by us when we choose to act, or because of this bigger question of human organizing amongst itself, like how do we come together in culture, this concept of responsibility became a key issue, especially in the West. And so if there's going to be responsibility, then it must mean that humans operate somehow differently than nature. And it's this drive that created this huge wedge between humans and the natural world that is oddly missing from this classical Chinese view of Ziran. It is much more, even in the concept of looking to nature as an exemplar for proper human behavior, there isn't this distinction. There's very much an idea that humans are a part of its natural world, that we are not separate from it, that we are a product of it in the same way that trees are, or, animals, or, wind and water and all these things are all made up of the same stuff, right? So in that classical Taoist perspective, um, there is no nothing, right? Even though it appears at some points as absence or emptiness, it's actually that unformed state that then goes through that transition into having form that we perceive as that 10,000 things. But those 10,000 things, including us, is all made up of the same component parts, if you will. From a quantum perspective, or even just in a classical perspective of modern physics, we're all made up of atoms. We're all made up of, and those atoms are ultimately made up of these particles. So it's all made up of the same stuff, following the same rules and patterns of how they work. So this wrestling then between the West and in this case we'll say China, because sometimes India gets lumped in with the East, but there's a lot more similarity between what's happening in India and the Western world in terms of some of their foundational thoughts. They definitely are expressed differently, but one of the fundamental ways that this idea of responsibility enters in is through a split in the world, where there's more of a dualistic way of looking at it, in terms of there's a physical and there's a spiritual. And somehow that spiritual aspect is where that notion of responsibility can come in, either through some type of aspect of divine in the human, or a soul, or a spirit, or something along those lines, is how they attempt to answer that question. And we definitely see that same fundamental split even within what we see within the different traditional teachings within India, that although they come with very different cultural ways of expressing it, are still very much what we see happening in the rest of the West in terms of this dualistic worldview, where we don't seem to see that in the same way in China. In ancient China, there's things that we can talk about as spiritual, but they're not in the sense of otherworldly. There are different aspects of this world. And in fact, there's a lot of scholars that would argue that when we're looking at something like the Daodejing, it is extremely naturalistic in terms of how they approach things. So there's a little bit maybe more of a large level cultural distinction between what's happening in ancient China and really the rest of the world. Anyway, obviously this stuff can be debated and there'll probably be different opinions on that, but it just helps us to look at least some of these core ideas that are being struggled with in terms of, do humans have responsibility, and is this required for how we think about how humans act? And if so, how in the world do we come up with it if all of nature that we recognize is functioning deterministically? Then somehow the West figured there's got to be a way out of this. There's got to be a way to make room for that. And it's this dualistic split that is happening that somehow tries to show that humans are separate from the rest of nature. Maybe I'll pause there for a second because there's a lot of ideas with that, and see if you guys have any thoughts.
It makes me think of that story, I don't know really what to call it, but if you're walking through the woods and you see like a beaver, it's like, oh, okay, that's nature. But if you see an old broken down car in the middle of the woods, you wouldn't think of that to be natural for some
Yeah.
reason, even though we're here too, and really anything we can do as humans could be considered natural. Yeah, it just makes me think, just even without having read this before, like it is common for us to separate ourselves, I think, from nature. And my other thought is like it was talking about how we, or the pre-smile state, and I'm wondering like, are we intended to try to get back to that by not like being the uncarved wood, and trying to get back to that, or are we meant to work with the pattern of the way that we're carved, like working with the pattern of gravity and all of the other patterns that we see?
Yeah, so the uncarved wood is really a way that they're assessing part of the social issues. And again, the context for all of this is that warring states period. You know, what's brought about this chaos that everything has devolved into this, all these states fighting against each other. And so the critique of the carved wood versus the uncarved wood has to do with social hierarchies that are attempting to place people in positions within society for the sake of society, but not necessarily for the sake of the individual. And so the uniqueness of the individual is being carved up in a sense to make the round peg fit in the square hole kind of an idea. And so they would say, as part of their social critique, that this is what's leading to that resistance is people don't want to be carved up. They have an essence of who they are that wants to express itself. And when society doesn't make room for that, then there's going to be this resistance, which is ultimately behind what's happening with this chaos. So I think that the idea also with the infant isn't that we go back to being infantile, right? It's more about recognizing the effects of that cultural shaping that has impacted us and how we can get past that to try and understand this more natural state of being, which again, from this Taoist perspective, is ideal, right? But from that Western perspective, this would be like exactly not ideal. Because if we're acting naturally, then in some respects, some of the critiques would be that then we're no different than the beasts, right? And if we're going to be any different than the beasts, then why are we human? So it's very interesting, like almost like a butting of the head about what human nature is and the rest of the world. Whereas in that Chinese concept, the idea is how do we more fully embrace what we are by understanding more what we are? In the same way that they talk about water, right? A fundamental story was for them about how an improper way of trying to do dams and irrigation ended up causing all kinds of flooding. But when a new emperor came along and understood how water actually works, understood the patterns, then they could do it in a proper way. And it was actually helpful. It brought about that irrigation and they could do what they needed to do from an agricultural perspective and not have the flooding and so forth. And so that idea of flow, of understanding how to not have blockages, understanding the patterns of how things work is not just for water, but also for people. And especially if you're thinking about government, right? How do you rule? For the Taoists, they would say you have to understand what people are if you're going to create a context in which they can flourish. And a context in which they can flourish, you're not carving them up. That what's happening when you're trying to carve them up is that it's becoming for the benefit of the ruler. And so therefore there's a heavy insistence on not having a personal agenda or personal desires from that position of being that sage king. The role has to be for the benefit of the people. And if it fails to meet that benefit of the people, that's where the concept of the mandate of heaven starts to come into play, and somebody's going to lose their right to rule, so to speak. So yeah, the key thing I just wanted to try and get at here is that this naturalistic, deterministic way of looking at the world is what's incorporated into this Daodejing philosophy that develops in classical China, in a way that's very distinct from what we've grown up with, and why we kind of butt up against it so much, because we definitely have this idea of, well, we have to be dealing with this question of responsibility. We have to be dealing with this, or we're kind of stuck thinking of ourselves as separate or independent from nature, as opposed to looking to nature for how we should actually be. It's an interesting quandary that we have inherited that sometimes goes unnoticed because we don't recognize the water we're swimming in. We're definitely creeping up on time, so I'm going to jump to the next slides here, but let me get through this real quick, and if there's some more questions, we'll grab them at the end. And if we need to pick it up next week, we can do that too. So going back to the beginning of the chapter, we can see these elements coming into play. So Tao, these patterns, is giving birth. Again, kind of this feminine critique over against this idea of this controlling masculine approach that's happening in the culture. Da is this idea of, again, personified as this rearing, but it has to do with how are those patterns fully externalized in terms of behavior. And then things, or the environment, is actually shaping us, and circumstances complete. Very interesting observation that really fits well with our best understanding of the nature of the world right now. So then it continues. Therefore, the 10,000 things, and this is worded awkwardly, but it's because it's trying to really follow what's actually in the Chinese. None do not respect. So in other words, it's saying all respect Tao and treasure Da. Tao is respected, Da is treasured, not by decree, but by spontaneity. And this is, again, that term, Zaran, right? So there's this kind of self-so aspect, this spontaneity that just comes about within this, in the natural context, when we don't have that cultural influence. There's something about the pattern of things and the way things are expressed naturally that is respected and treasured, and it just happens of itself. It's effortless. It's just something that happens internally. Therefore, Tao gives birth, again, kind of reiterating that way of looking at it. And then it says, Da keeps, grows, nurtures, matures, ripens, covers, and buries. So it's very interesting, like full circle of life thing that we see. And it's like that natural pattern, right? What is that natural pattern? Well, there's something about it, that this growing and this nurturingness that we see, again, this indigenous worldview that survived that agricultural revolution, that is being reasserted here through this Taoist approach, that is trying to recapture that worldview of the world as generative as opposed to a collection of resources, that it's something that is the source of life and nurturing as opposed to something to be conquered and controlled. And of course, with that whole cycle, then things come into existence and out of existence. That movement from absence to presence, from unformed to formed, also goes back. So it's an ongoing back and forth that's being pictured here in terms of what that full circle of life looks like. Then it has some interesting points here: to give birth without possession, to act without holding on to grow without lording over. And I think here what they're trying to demonstrate is this seemingly impossible role of a mother, right? So if we think about this in more of an ideal state, when we have children, we don't possess them, at least not if we want them to grow up healthy, right? The idea is that we are giving that nourishment and that birth to grow them into something where they kind of become their own people and go on to do their own thing. Yes, there's obviously the relationship between us, but the idea is you can't hold on to it. You can't possess it. You have to allow things to grow and continue. And each of these are kind of wrestling with that struggle, right? Of how do we give birth to something but not try to control it, not lording over it. And this could be seen not just with children, but anything that we do in life, whether it's a project we create at work or some creative piece that we come up with. There's the same point where if we try to control it and hold on to it, there's the struggle that we're going to wrestle with, because things are constantly changing. Everything is impermanent, everything is in movement. But the more we can embrace that change and allow things to grow in the way that they need to grow without trying to control, then we're going to see more of a healthy benefit. And this I see as at that core of like that ideal motherhood, which again, the reassertion of that yin within that yin yang balance from the Taoist critique on society of how do we reintroduce more of that novelty and that life-giving aspect of the feminine over the controlling aspect and the masculine domination that was out of balance in that warring states period. And they would say then, going back to what we saw in chapter 1, that this is called dark da, or in chapter 1, it said darkness within darkness, the gateway to all understanding, right? And again, that dark is not dark in the sense of like evil or foreboding. It's, if we think about that yin yang, the dark part of that, the dark side, is the feminine aspect. It's that yin. It's how is that reasserted here? And here, the imagery of the woman who's giving birth and allowing that newness to happen, not trying to control, but allowing it to develop, is the aspect that they are trying to reassert in an overly controlling, dominating type of a social situation. So lots in this chapter. We got just a couple minutes. If there's some final questions, I just had to kind of run through the end real quick. It also ends up being kind of an interesting transition for Mother's Day that's coming up this weekend in the US. Speaking of mothers.
I hadn't thought about the responsibility, and I just want to keep it quick. It feels like we've talked about deterministic worlds and undeterministic worlds in the very past. And after watching the Devs TV show, I'm like, maybe there is more to the deterministic part as well. It makes me think that just because we as humans developed some sort of a capacity for more complexity that, say, animals or plants have, that maybe just created much more capacity for more complex rules that then still become deterministic at the end of the world. At the end of the day, they're still deterministic, but there's so many influences and so many complexities that it's impossible for our current capacity of understanding to be able to determine the stuff ourselves. And because our our decisions are driven by knowledge, wisdom, and circumstances, and all the other knowing that we have, it's just impossible for us to collect everything about a person to be able to determine what decision they're going to make. So between the deterministic and the responsibility, I see the responsibility being the delta between what we consider deterministic today, because we can analyze and we can say we can predict what the behavior is going to be, and the deterministic where we cannot understand it. The delta between we just simply have not capacity to be able to determine that. Therefore, we call that responsibility, because otherwise there's we have, if we have no responsibility, we can just do whatever we want. That's it's kind of a forcing us to try to do the best with the lack of understanding or lack of predictability that we have in about ourselves as humans. So I still would say it's still deterministic, but it's just a different level of deterministic between humans and the rest of the nature, which behaves on much more simpler, even though not completely simple, but much more simpler rules than what humans behave upon. And that's what I would call responsibility. Still deterministic, but it's the delta.
Yeah. And one of the ways this is sometimes dealt with is in terms of how we think about responsibility. There's all kinds of, in our legal system, things like mitigating circumstances, right?
Mm-hmm.
that affect the degree to which we can talk about responsibility. So within more of a deterministic framework, one of the ways they talk about responsibility is positional responsibility. So each of us would be the location in which this long chain of causal chain of cause and effect that's way preceded our even birth, right? That's coming to a focus in who we are at a particular point in time. There's positional responsibility, but then what that means is that how we look at the results of those actions is not simply that person's choices, right? It has to include all these other factors, including the culture, including the environment, and the history and the genetics and all that kind of thing, where we can still hold people accountable in the sense of these are behaviors that we do or do not want in society, and we can either reward or punish those things. But then the punishment becomes more in terms of thinking of like more like a public health issue, right? Somebody gets a cold, we don't let them out in public, not because they did something bad, but because we're trying to think about the welfare of other people. So if we think about bad behavior in that same kind of context, the goal with that individual is not how do we get our pound of flesh because they broke the rules, but how do we look at doing more of a restorative? How do we heal kind of the situation? And the same thing with merit, right? We can't overly glamorize particular behavior because ultimately they're not fully responsible, right? But at the same time, it might be behaviors that we want to encourage. And that encouragement and discouragement becomes part of the framework that the deterministic world then operates with. So one of the key components, as opposed to thinking about free will, is actually, are we learning systems? And that's where things like reward and punishment can actually have an impact. Obviously, we need more time to unpack all these things, but yeah, it's fascinating stuff. All right.
Sure.
Well, I think we're going to have to bring it to a close for today, but hopefully that'll give you something to chew on over lunch today. And we'll come back next week. If you've been watching this as a video and you'd like to join the live discussion, you can register your email at www.kinship.cafe, and you will get an email invitation for links to the Zoom presentation, as well as where we meet locally if you happen to be in the Southern California area and would like to have an in-person meeting. With that, we'll see you all next time, and thanks so much for joining.
Thank you, Jim.
Thanks, Jim.